We have lost the art of relationship, and Dr. Mark Mayfield has the way to move you from isolation to connection. Moses gave 2 simple commands to the people of Israel that are good for us now as well. And Sean Evans conquered his fear and turned it into a dream job. It's his ticket into the Hall of Heroes, coming up on episode 90 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, it's Mark Mayfield, has written a book about loneliness called The Path Out of Loneliness, and I feel like this is a silly place to start, but let's define it. How would you define loneliness?
So I define loneliness as the state of being unseen or unnoticed, relationally, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. It can be driven by a lack of purpose, meaning, relationship, and or identity. And I think the key here is it's marked by a deep sense of hopelessness, just that we don't have much direction or much hope for the future.
I think that's a great definition of how a lot of people have been feeling, and me in some points too, the last year and a half, right, during COVID.
Been something that I've noticed just in the field, creeping up, more prevalent before COVID, but obviously lockdowns and isolation and that kind of stuff has really exacerbated it.
In your book, you mentioned that there's the biblical origins of loneliness. I thought that was kind of interesting. What is that?
I don't think this is a bad thing. We often read Genesis through a singular lens, right? When Adam and Eve took of the fruit, sin entered into the world, and we've been fighting to get back into right relationship with God ever since. But I wanted to take a different look at it, and I wanted to look at it from a perspective of when that the fruit was taken of by Adam and Eve. Obviously, sin entered into the world, but we miss, I think, the depth of that isolation and separation is what entered in. That was the death that Satan spoke of, even though Adam and Eve were thinking physical death. It was that separation. And when we see God walking through the garden, looking, he asked the question, "Where are you?" I don't really believe he was geographically challenged. I believe he could not be in front of sin and really felt that separation and that isolation. And so, I look at that as kind of the origin of loneliness. But one of the things I was always looking for is how is the Greek and the Hebrew going to show the word for relationship? And as I was digging through the Septuagint and the original Greek, there was not any word for relationship. The word I kept on coming back to was redemption through adoption. So how beautiful is that when sin, separation, and loneliness entered into the story, there was the first time the word for redemption was there as well. And we see it in the faithfulness of God to Calvary, right? And then to the empty tomb of that fulfillment.
So I thought this was I've had this struggle in my own life, and I think a lot of people have. In the book, you talk about the lie of success and how you have to define it. And I think so many of us have a hard time defining it. So talk a little bit about that and how if we don't define it correctly, it really can make us lonely. And
I think there are so many things in our current culture that are exacerbating this idea of loneliness, right? And we're chasing things thinking that that's going to fulfill us. I remember watching or reading an article once about this billionaire about not being satisfied with the money he had. He was afraid that he was going to lose it all, and all he was fighting for was the next $100 million or whatever. And I'm sitting there going, you have billions of dollars and you're satisfied. I don't get that. But it's this idea of we're chasing things that we think are going to fulfill us. As we chase those things and we achieve them, they don't provide the fulfillment, or they don't provide that engagement with what we thought was going to make us, whole. And in turn, we sit in the midst of what we were chasing, and we find that we're even more lonely than we were before. And so this definition of success is, I just really challenge the readers to go, okay, all right, if you're chasing wealth, that's great, but what's the end all be all? If you're chasing notoriety, that's fine. What's the end all be all? And I think a lot of times we're chasing things because we don't want to sit with the fact that we're not known and we're not seen and we're not valued the way that we want to be. And so when we get to the end of what we're chasing, we're probably more lonely than we were before we started chasing it. And so I really and I work with a lot of teens and families. And so I really have mom and dad go, let's define success for our families so that our kids aren't chasing things that are going to leave them relationally inept or relationally ignored.
So later on in the book, you talk about that the greatest commandment in the Bible can get us out of this loneliness epidemic. And I just love how you just kind of keep going back to the Bible, things like this. And, we know this, but it's always kind of nice to say, okay, the Bible it wasn't just for back then, it's meant for now. And there's applications now. So talk about that a little bit.
And this is where I just really challenge Western Christians. It's great to listen to our pastors, do that, but listen with a critical ear. listen with some skepticism, and go back and study the scriptures for yourselves. And I think that's where we get lost sometimes. And don't just read the English definitions. There's a lot of great resources online to dig into the Greek and the Hebrew, because I think we really gained the depth of understanding in that. And that was where I was unlocked for me in the greatest commandment. We read that through kind of a list system, Western list system. Love God, check. Love our neighbors, check. Love ourselves, I'll get there. And as you read that, the second is like it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. The second is like it is the Greek word homoios, which means equal to. And as you pull back, I think we need to rethink the list system and look at it more as a cycle, a cyclical system, that our relationship with God, our relationship with our neighbors, and our relationship with ourselves is in that cycle. And if any one of those is lacking, the cycle actually gets out of balance. But in the midst of that cycle, right, either over the cycle or in the middle of the cycle is the triune God. I think we often go, okay, if I love God really well, I love my neighbors well, great. But when we don't love ourselves equally, I honestly believe we can't love God and love others well. And I think we're lying to ourselves. And so we have to put some stake and some focus into ourselves in a way that is honoring to who God has created us to be in the image of the triune God.
Okay, so now we just talked about how we shouldn't do lists, but I did like the list at the end of the book. The 3 steps to get out of the loneliness journey. So let's unpack that. So just go through each step and let's talk about what that looks like.
And that's the thing is, I think that's where I think as far as our own brain needs steps, right? So what are we going to do to engage the coming out of loneliness? And I think it's this idea that we've got to look introspectively into ourselves, right? We've got to be vulnerable in our own story. And I think a lot of our caregivers, in such a way that we want to be doing things all the time, right? We want to be looking at our neighbor, looking at our friend. We want to be engaging those things. That's great, but we're not going to do that unless we actually take care of ourselves first. And so I think one of my biggest things with anybody that I work with is there's not a formula, but the first step is asking the question, how am I doing? How am I doing honestly? And journaling, if somebody's a journaler, if somebody likes to, however people do it, ask the question, how am I doing really? And taking stock of that. And if I'm not doing okay, that's scary for a lot of people to say that I'm not doing okay, but it's the reaching out for help. One of my favorite counselors in the field is Dr. Irving Yalom, and he talks about this idea that it's okay to have a paid friend sometimes. And I think sometimes that's where we go because they've been burned by friends around us or by people in the church. And it's not an accusation. It's just sometimes what happens. And so sometimes we need to find somebody outside of that to walk with us. And so a counselor might be the best place to start, but finding a Christian counselor, right? And that could be scary too. And so, I've got resources for individuals if they're looking for that kind of stuff. They can always seek me out on my webpage. But so being vulnerable, but then being teachable. Once we're vulnerable, right? Once we say, okay, how am I doing? Being teachable means there's things that I don't know. And if there's things that I don't know, who is going to teach me in walking through these next steps? And I think that's a big piece as well, being teachable. And then just, I think, putting ourselves out there, walking through, if we've been through it and we've gone down the path a little bit farther, we got to turn around and begin to help others walk through this. And I've had people frustrated with me on this book because Mark, there's no formula on how to get out of this. I'm like, there really isn't a formula. It's these things that we do as we become more like Christ that lead us to a greater awareness of ourselves, of others, and where we fit in. Even if we are farther down the path, it doesn't mean we're not going to fight bouts of loneliness. I still fight with bouts of loneliness, but it's this pervasive loneliness that I'm talking about that we need to figure out ways to get out of.
All right. So one last question. I was just thinking about if someone buys this book and starts reading it because they are looking for that path out of loneliness, and they're at that place where and you share incredible stories of your life and other people's lives where, you're just kind of at the end of your rope. So if someone's at their end of the rope today, before they even crack open the book, what's the first thing that they can do just to start that getting path out of loneliness?
They've already done it to be really encouraging, right? If they're listening to this and they're like, okay, something needs to change, that's the first step. I think that recognition that something's not right. I think in our Western culture, our Instagram, Facebook culture, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever else you want to throw in there, culture, we portray and put our best selves out front. And I think there's that misconception that that's how we have to live our lives. And it's not true at all. And so I think that's the first step, to be honest, is that recognition that, okay, something's off. And if something's off, that doesn't mean I'm broken. That doesn't mean that I'm beyond repair. That doesn't mean that there's no hope. It just means I've got to do something about it. And so that first step is just that recognition. And then it's going, okay, can I call up a friend? Do I call the radio station and get connected with a pastor? Do I call, a church that's close by? Do I, look through and find a counselor? I think that's the biggest piece, because we, a lot of times, are in the echo chamber. We think that we have the answers, but it's just our voices coming back to us. And so getting out and getting some other opinions and perspectives is going to be huge in helping us figure these things out.
Now looking at the Bible, picking it up in Deuteronomy 8, verse 1. Be careful to obey all the commands I am giving you today. Then you will live and multiply, and you will enter and occupy the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness for these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character, and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry, and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. For all these 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out, and your feet didn't blister or swell. Think about it. Just as a parent disciplines a child, the Lord your God disciplines you for your own good. So obey the commands of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a land of flowing streams and pools of water, with fountains and springs that gush out in the valleys and hills. It is a land of wheat and barley, of grapevines, fig trees, and pomegranates, of oil and honey. It is a land where food is plentiful and nothing is lacking. It's a land where iron is as common as stone, and copper is abundant in the hills. When you have eaten your fill, be sure to praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. But that is the time to be careful. Beware that in your plenty you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, regulations, and decrees that I am giving you today. For when you have become full and prosperous and have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large, and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time, and forget the Lord your God, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. Do not forget that he led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its poisonous snakes and scorpions, where it was so hot and dry. He gave you water from the rock. He fed you with manna in the wilderness, a food unknown to your ancestors. He did this to humble you and test you for your own good. He did all this so that you would never say to yourself, I have achieved this wealth with my own strength and energy. Remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you power to be successful. In order to fulfill the covenant he confirmed to your ancestors with an oath. But I assure you of this, if you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, worshiping and bowing down to them, you will certainly be destroyed. Just as the Lord has destroyed other nations in your path, you will also be destroyed if you refuse to obey the Lord your God. Powerful words to a people that were about to go into a promised land. There was a bit of a changing of the guards here, right? The people that had known the really tough times in Egypt, God brought them out of it, and had been wandering the desert, were looking forward to going into the promised land, but because they didn't accept that right away, that generation was cut off. They're not allowed to enter the promised land. So this next generation that has only known wandering in the desert, they're going to have the socks blessed off or something like that. God's just reminding them right here that blessings are coming. But remember always, and this is so hard to do, where the blessings came from. Thinking of my life. In the good times, it's easy to just cruise without God. But those are I would say this, that every moment is an important moment to really pour into God. But it may be even more important when things are really good to pour into God. The times when we don't think we need him. Those are the times we need him the most. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Sean Evans. wasn't the typical thrill seeker. As a young boy, his first roller coaster ride left him terrified. So much so that he swore off amusement parks for years. But then COVID hit, and he had lots of time to surf YouTube, and he was watching other people do amusement park reviews and ride rides, and he thought that kind of looks fun. So in May of 2021, he embarked on a journey that would change his life forever. He started a YouTube channel, Lift Hills and Thrills, where he documented his adventures exploring theme parks. What made it stand out? Well, he wasn't just any roller coaster enthusiast. Despite being terrified of heights and suffering from vertigo, Sean decided to make a career out of riding these towering beasts. And the rest is history. He now earns 6 figures traveling the world, conquering coasters, and sharing his experiences with over 20,000 subscribers. So because Sean has taken his fear and turned it into his greatest strength, and is doing what most of us only dream of, making a career out of living his passion, he is officially in the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. He was a pastor that lost his faith, and how Bobby Conway found it again is encouragement for you as well. Taking a look at the Bible, we'll see God's instructions on how to handle adversity and victory. And Billy Gibbons wasn't just a man caught between two worlds, he chose to live in both of them. And it's his time machine into the Hall of Heroes, coming up next week on Manly with Andy. Manly with Andy is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.